Hello, and welcome to uPhilosopher. So it's been a little while, and I guess now I have no excuse, so I might be putting out a few of these. The the thing that I want to talk about today is, of course, the big topic, which is the coronavirus. The first thing I should say, though, is that I'm not going to be giving any trying to dispense any healthcare advice. Please just listen to your healthcare professionals. That's far beyond my purview. I am not that kind of doctor. So, what do I want to talk about in regards to the coronavirus? I want to talk about really kind of our response to it, in particular, the response of our politicians. And the thing that kind of inspired me really to look at this and to have a conversation about it was in part having a conversation with my grandmother about it. And of course, I'm worried about her being older and particularly susceptible. And we just had such a strange conversation because, really because of a couple of things. One of which is that my grandmother seems to genuinely believe, or to at least genuinely consider it as possible, that the coronavirus was created by the Chinese and that it was created by them specifically to kill the elderly. And leaving aside the fact that this, seems really quite laughable, the main concern that I have here is that it feeds a whole bunch of fears, and it seems to stem out of a whole bunch of fears, that someone can kind of even hold kind of a thought process like that. Now, I'm going to work under the assumption that most people aren't worried about that, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time at the show trying to debunk that particular conspiracy theory. That being said, I think it does kind of show the way our politicians are kind of talking about it in general. One good example is, of course, the fact that President Trump has been consistently pointing at China and kind of blaming China and referring to it as a Chinese virus, which is something that we're going to want to talk a bit more about. But that kind of direction, if you think about it, feeds a narrative that there is this other of whom we should be scared of. Like that the best things that we can do are kind of lock down the borders, that it's less important in terms of our infrastructure. And, things like hospital beds and respirators and things like that are less the issue, right? That we, nationally aren't as much the issue, and it's more interactions with others. So that's certainly concerning. The thing, though, that it really kind of points to for me is the fact that people are really scared. And I think there's a danger there in that the fear that we're talking about is really just a fear of mortality. It's a fear of those things that are outside of our power. And we spend most of our days working under the assumption that we can control the things that are going to happen to us, right? That we can, make it to work on time and feed our kids and, go see our doctor for the checkup, and everything's going to continue pretty status quo. An event like this comes around, and what happens is we suddenly are reminded of the fact that we are very mortal. We have virtually no power over what happens to us, especially when it comes to big picture stuff. In other words, when it comes to stuff like an asteroid impact, right? There's just very little that we can do about that, right? Something like a pandemic, there's more that we can do. And thankfully, this one, the mortality rate is lower than it could be in comparison with, say, with other plagues and things like that. But even so, even if it's a smaller asteroid or a pandemic with a lower mortality rate, it's still something that endangers us. Tragically, a lot of people die, and kind of happens all at once, and reminds us that we don't really have the ability to do big stuff like move the earth so that it's not impacted by an asteroid, or simply make it so that pandemics aren't a problem, or simply just cure cancer, right? There's all of these things that are really big. And I think the reason why that particular narrative appeals to my grandmother is because it means that it's human beings that are causing it, as opposed to it's just something that happened that's really beyond our control. Uh, the idea that the Chinese have done it means that human beings have done it, and that the universe isn't just something that willy-nilly will occasionally just throw something awful like a mega volcano at you and you have no say in it. I think that's why, I mean, I haven't seen as much of this as I think we would have, say, maybe 50 or 100 years ago or something like that, but I still think we're seeing a fair amount of it. Why there's also an inclination to either blame some sort of conspiracy, or basically to blame some sort of divine retribution, right? In other words, well, the God's doing this. This is a punishment um, that's being leveled against humanity. But at that point, that still means that human beings are in fact doing something to cause it, that we're playing a causal role in our fate. And I think what's really terrifying for us, maybe even scarier than our mortality, is the idea of not being in control of our fate, not being in control of what's going to happen to us. And simply having someone come up to us and say, listen, you really just don't have that much control over it. Yeah, it's a relatively low mortality rate in comparison with maybe some other illnesses, but you won't necessarily know who has it for sure. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have a cure. If you get it, you just basically have to kind of hunker down and hope that you get better and take some medication to help with the symptoms. And that means that we have very little say or control over what happens. And so I think saying things like, well, you can close the borders down, which, I mean, you can never really fully close them down, for one. But those kinds of things are ways of also kind of demonstrating a certain level of power or control, even though it probably won't have as much of a immediate impact as one would think. And doing other things like increasing, hospital beds and, saving masks for healthcare professionals and having companies build more respirators and things like that, those seem in some way like they acquiesce to the problem. Oh, well, those are ways of kind of saying, oh, I guess people are going to get sick, and so we should be prepared. And that's a very kind of scary thing to admit. So the other thing that was interesting to me that my grandmother brought up is, in my conversation with her, I explained a certain level of dismay at the way that this has been handled. And it seems I probably kind of already made clear that there are things that one can do to kind of prepare to deal with a circumstance like this. They're not particularly attractive things. They're not, sudden and big cure things, but there are things that kind of have to do with infrastructure and trying to help minimize the impact on the on hospitals and on the healthcare industry in general. And so those kinds of things, in fact, are they're all smaller things that you can do that have a really big impact, but you have to do them kind of early. And so I kind of expressed that one of the things that had concerned me was the fact that we used to have a pandemic response team, and so that was part of basically our government. And a while back, President Trump, right, his administration had disbanded it, presumably under the assumption that if something bad happens, like a pandemic, we'll be able to just we'll be able to respond quickly enough. We'll be able to put a team together. And this is a cost-saving measure. And in addition to that, there's also been fairly significant cuts to the CDC, to the Center for Disease Control. Now, by my lights, these are all things that'll slow the process down. It's kind of like kind of going, well, it's pretty unlikely that we're going to be struck by an asteroid, so we don't want to really waste our money preparing for it. And obviously there's ways of preparing for it that would be very, very, very expensive, but then there's also ways of preparing for it that aren't that expensive, that just have to do let's just kind of have a group of people that will make a plan, and that'll kind of check the healthcare industry, keep an eye on things, see how and be ready to prepare the infrastructure for if it happens. That way you at least have a plan set up. And my understanding that's basically what the pandemic response team, that their kind of job was, right? That this idea of okay, well, we're not going to spend the money acting as if there's a pandemic now, but this this particular group is kind of tasked with having the ideas ready for the different kinds of circumstances that might arise in case they do. So it seems reasonable to suggest then that because we didn't have that, and because the CDC had less funding, so on and so forth, because of things like that, more people will have died than would have had we had that team. In other words, we would have been able to respond more quickly. Now, I've come to realize that it's something of a political argument rather than just kind of a basic factual one as to whether or not the White House has responded quickly enough. And I hear, different arguments from both sides. I hear from one side, well, he closed the border down with China. That's the most important thing that he could have done. He did it very quickly. We've never had a president act so quickly in a crisis like this, and he should be lauded for so doing. And I've also heard arguments coming from the other direction in terms of, well, there's a whole host of things that could have been done that weren't done, particularly because it seemed like the president was kind of downplaying it. So anyways, in expressing my concern about two things that don't really, I think, fall into that kind of political argument, just, well, it would have been nice if we had had a pandemic response team. I like to see more funding for the CDC in general, because this is all just kind of a matter of preparedness and being careful. My grandmother kind of immediately responded, well, where are you getting your news? You must be getting your news from places that are very partisan and hate the president. And I'm like, well, no, I mean, those are just like things that the White House has done. I mean, you can just like go to the White House, website and, look up facts and figures and numbers and what committees exist. And my grandmother's response to that was, well, who makes the White House website is probably a bunch of people who hate the president. They're probably making stuff that's against him. I'm like, well, no, that's actually the administration that makes that. I was like, plus, I mean, the president has talked about it. Like, he's admitted that the administration has done it. I mean, his last conversation about it last time I checked, the president said, well, no, it wasn't me that did it, but we did it, but it's not a big deal. So, the administration took responsibility, though he personally said he didn't, order that. Either which way, right, it's the White House administration. And, she was kind of like, well, I don't know, that just sounds very biased to me. And that to me is very worrisome, because what I realize is one of the things that I definitely think that I can, without being particularly partisan, criticize about the White House's response to this has been that the White House has been pretty willing to cast any media that discusses the coronavirus in ways that they don't like as partisan, anti-Trump, and trying to make him look bad. And they really tried hard to gain control of the information early on. And I think that brings up a main concern that we really should look at, which is who should have control of the information regarding health and the danger to people in a situation like this. And I'm seeing kind of two responses. And one of which is the response like, well, this is a democratic republic. I need all of the information necessary so that I can make decisions about my own health, but also so that when I vote and I make decisions, that I'm making informed decisions about everybody as well. So, say regarding like tax funding for things like the CDC, so on and so forth. But there's other people who are going to argue, well, this kind of information is dangerous, that it could be misused, it could cause a panic, and that really we should trust our authority figures to kind of know what's best in terms of giving information to us. And that certainly seems to be some of the direction that the White House has taken. It took me a little while, like I was kind of briefly confused as to why Vice President Pence had been appointed to the task, to leading the task force when it came to the coronavirus, when there seemed like there's other people who are more qualified. And especially as that was a criticism that was leveled against the Obama administration when it came to Ebola. This idea of like, oh, well, he didn't appoint someone who's, an expert in this way. And so it seemed kind of strange, like Vice President Pence doesn't seem to have any particular special knowledge about this. So I was a little confused. But then, like when looking up what his responsibility and role is in this, well, one of his main responsibilities and roles became that all information that would be given out by, various directors of, things like the CDC and so on and so forth, by people who are in charge of the health response, it has to go through him. And so this was a very kind of clean and quick way of making sure that information that seemed in some way negative or potentially, right, we could argue could cause a panic or something like this would have to be kind of checkmarked by Pence first. And well, on one hand, again, the argument is well, this could be good in that, we're trusting our leaders to provide us with information because the people, could panic. After all, look what's happened with toilet paper. But the other side of the coin is well, this is also exceedingly dangerous and smacks in a lot of ways of, say, like China's response, which is to kind of have control over its own media, which again is kind of antithetical to democracy. If I'm going to be making decisions about my health, and if I'm going to be making voting decisions that could impact other people's health, I really need to know as much information as possible. And I think we all generally can agree that there have to be limits to what kind of information people have, particularly when it comes, say, like troop locations and battle plans and so on and so forth. But when it comes to issues like this pandemic, the general thrust is that, well, it's a democracy, and I can't make decisions for myself or wise voting decisions if I don't really know what's going on and know what's going on with some immediacy. So there's one concern there. But the general, in addition to kind of having more control over the information, the administration has seemed very kind of comfortable with casting the media, and this has been going on for a while, in a really negative light. And in fact, those media outlets that are more kind of pro the Trump administration have seemed, very comfortable kind of adding to that and supporting the idea that the president is being accosted by media that's using this in a way to try and harm him. One classic example being the president's son basically said something along the lines of, there are those who are hoping that many people are going to die because it's going to make the president look bad. And that's, of course, paraphrasing, and I don't want to say anything particularly unfair about Donald Trump Jr. That being said, that really seemed to be what he was saying, which is that there are basically people who are rooting for this to be a terrible circumstance so that the president will lose the election. And that seems to me to be very, very telling insofar as, well, one, there's just this assumption that people who are liberal or on the left or whatever that happens to mean are really awful, right? And really want people to be hurt if it means that the president is going to be harmed. And it seems to me that is profoundly unfair, especially to the vast, there might be someone who's like, yay, millions might die. But that would seem to be the case probably with any political grouping, right? There's always someone out there who's a terrible person. But it also feeds a narrative that seems very convenient for the president and for those who support him, which is that the Democrats are always trying to say that they care about you, but in reality, they're willing to sacrifice you for their own political ends. And, oh, look, here's verification. Look, they're criticizing the president's response. Doesn't that just add evidence to what I was saying, that they want this to go poorly? So now what has been created is kind of a media environment where anytime someone criticizes what the president is doing or asks if the president could do it better, it automatically just is proof. It's evidence, it's confirmation that, see, they do want it to go poorly. They do want people to die, as opposed to being advocates for information and for the people, just trying to get the information out there. Now, to say that this isn't political, I think would be foolish. To say that people's words aren't kind of taken and twisted, I think would be dishonest. For one good example of that is the fact that, I don't know if we can say that the president genuinely believes or has stated in some sort of clear way that the virus itself is an actual hoax. His language there is problematic because it's unclear the way he uses hoax, but the way he used hoax with the impeachment was to say that it was a hoax, which can't mean that him being impeached is a hoax, because he actually was impeached, right? That wasn't made up. He actually was impeached. So what he must mean by hoax is that there's information that's being used against him, right? That it's being spun in a particular way that is disingenuous or false, or just to make him look bad. Presumably, that's what he means when he uses the word hoax in association with the coronavirus. I think it would be decidedly unfair to say, oh, well, he just doesn't believe it happens. Rather, he thinks that the information about it is being used in a way to harm him. The real concern, and I think it's important that we stay out of people's heads because we don't know, is whether or not the president in fact downplayed it because of the fear of the way that it would impact him politically. There's no question, and this is important, there's no question that it can and likely will impact him politically. But what's strange about it is it probably should. That's important to realize. It especially in an election year, what I mean is that whether or not a president handles a crisis well is one of the main kind of deciding factors on whether or not we think someone is or is not fit for office, right? Whether or not they're the person that we want leading us during times of crisis. And various crises, often will define a president. So things like the response to Hurricane Katrina had a significant impact on George W. Bush's approval rating, the way that people viewed him as a president. And so the same could be said true of any president, whether or not it's Clinton, Obama, or whomever, that their way of responding to a crisis kind of defines them. And so it is fair then to really examine and look at whether or not people are going to die, or more people than would have had we acted differently, as a result of the president's actions. So we want to leave aside, though, and I think this is important, like we have to recognize, okay, well, there's going to be bickering on both sides, there's going to be finger pointing, and really what ends up being important is that people are like coming together to try and deal with the crisis. And we want voices of calm, and we want voices of truth, right, to kind of help guide everyone through this so that we don't have to suffer a worse crisis than we have. And that, I think, leads to kind of two final points that I want to make. One, it doesn't matter if only, supposedly, we'll put in quotes, a few people die as a result of this. This comparison to the flu and so on and so forth are remarkably unfair for a series of reasons. One, because the flu is kind of already out there, even if the mortality rate was the same, which it seems that it is not, it doesn't happen all at once the way this is happening all at once, and therefore it's not likely that you'll have people die just because they can't get hospital beds, which is in some ways an increasing possibility here with the coronavirus, and something that we really need to be careful about. But even if it were true that it was some sort of minimum, that's someone's family member, right? That's a person, that's someone who's loved, and this tendency to kind of be like, oh, well, it's not that big a deal, let's just compare it to something else, well, let's just kind of minimize it. I wouldn't say to someone who lost a family member because of the flu, well, it's just the flu, what's the big deal? Especially when they didn't have to. Like, if someone dies because of the flu and it's everyone did everything they could, and they were able to get them to the hospital, and they got the best medical treatment available, and it wasn't because of a lack of information, because people were playing it down, or because people were responding selfishly, hoarding ventilators or whatever. If it was something that we did everything right and it still happened, it's a tragedy. If it's something that happens when we really could have done better, which is really the concern here when it comes to the coronavirus, well, then that's a responsibility, right? So it goes beyond just being a tragedy, which is pretty awful, into being like, I'm responsible for that tragedy. We socially are responsible for that tragedy. And so that's the last thing that I want to mention, is just this problem of responsibility. It seems that there could be a lot of arguments on either side regarding whether or not the Trump administration has responded well. Certainly, I think casting the media in a particular way is dangerous, because then when people in the media try and warn others about the danger of something, well, they're less likely to listen to them and be like, oh, well, the president or the president's allies are just saying this is being made an even bigger deal. And so now we have a lot of people who aren't taking it seriously. And maybe they won't die but they could contract it and give it to someone who does. And that puts blood on people's hands, right? And particularly on the hands of those who are minimizing it or not really kind of taking responsibility for what they say. And I think the best example of that, because yes, there can be arguments, okay, well, he closed the border, they're working on, passage of bills that'll get money out there to people. Like, there's a lot of stuff that people can argue that he's done right. There's a lot of stuff that people could argue he's done wrong, like with the CDC, whatever. But something that seems really clear is that we've had a series of problems, like things like, at least for a while, where the president kind of refused to do things like get tested and refused to do things like shake hands. Now, eventually, at least, he's claimed to change, like, oh, I got tested, but he's still, even in talking about it, was like, oh, everyone kept whining about it, and so finally I just went ahead and got tested. But the reason why people were saying he should get tested was, well, because he had come into contact with other people who were confirmed positive cases. And so the tendency to be like still going out there and shaking hands, to be like, no, I don't want to get tested, or to act like it's such a hassle to do so. What's the problem here? The problem is that it continues to promote the idea that we all live as individuals who have no impact on other people and therefore don't really have a responsibility to it. And it's a problem of modeling. It's a problem of forgetting that children watch what you do, and that your fans and the president is generally considered the most respected person in the country, right? Everything that he does is something that impacts, children and other people who see it and think, okay, well, this is the way that I should act. And it's kind of like when he, took the glasses off to look directly at an eclipse. Well, what's the problem? Like, it's his eyes, right? And that seems to be honest, I think what's kind of gotten us into this mess in the first place, both in terms of the virus, but then also the economic problem is that, like, well, no, it's my eyes, it's my problem. No, it's my health, it's my problem. If I get sick, it's my problem. If something bad happens, it's my problem. But it isn't just your problem. If it's something like a virus, like, you literally can give it to other people. And when it's something like, okay, yeah, it's just your eyes when you're looking at the sun, sure, unless you're a parent, at which point your kids are going to be like, oh, well, then I guess I can do it too. Or when you're the president, and then you have like millions of people who see that and go, okay, well, I might, and maybe you'll be fine, but maybe they won't. And so the biggest concern that I have is this kind of, it's not like an issue of, well, because some people I think can say, well, maybe he's kind of downplaying it to kind of help people stay calm. Sure. But you still want to model like, oh, everyone should be calm, but I'm still not shaking hands right now. Why? Just because that's the recommendation of our healthcare professionals, and we all should listen to them. And don't you want to model me, right? If I'm doing this, isn't that good reason for you to do it too? And so I think that speaks just to this larger social problem that we all need to take responsibility for. Over the course of, it hasn't just been the last few years, but it's been increasing, and it's been a while. This tendency just to kind of go, well, listen, my problems are my problems and your problems are your problems. But that's not how something like this works. And to be honest, that's not how a society works. That's not how an economy works, right? My problems are my problems and your problems are your problems. And let's just like party as much as we can and not worry about the impacts until later is great until later. And so I think this is a real opportunity for us, while a lot of us are sitting in isolation, to kind of reflect on our own behavior, leaving aside even criticism of the president or whoever it is we feel like criticizing, and asking ourselves, like, okay, well, when I make decisions, have I just kind of given myself the freedom to just kind of do whatever, like, I eat what I want, and it doesn't matter who it impacts or who's hurt by it, what farmer, what animal, whatever else. It doesn't matter the impact, the way I drive and what I drive doesn't matter. What its impact on the environment is, whether I shake hands or cough into my hand or into someone's face, it doesn't matter. Like, all of these things at the end of the day follow the same kind of practical course, which is the idea that, like, I don't really have a responsibility to the things that happen, maybe because of what I do. And it seems like we've spent a while now kind of going, well, what I do doesn't really matter. But it's funny because people are now talking about like how some of the areas where like travel has gone down and so on and so forth, like pollution has drastically decreased. Like there's areas where like people are seeing blue sky for the first time in like 10 years. We actually do have an impact. We have an impact on other people. We have an impact on people who model our behaviors. We have an impact on people who we can help get sick, the things that we buy, the things that we drive, the places we work, the things that we say impact other people. And the final example I want to give about this is calling this the Chinese virus, right? In calling it the Chinese virus, well, okay, maybe that's perfectly reasonable, right? It started in China. Why don't we just name things where they come from? Well, there's a lot of argument against that, but it's beyond the purview of the show for today. But the point being is that going to cause people like my grandmother to be more afraid of the Chinese? Is it going to cause people to not order from Chinese restaurants, even though the people who work there were born in the United States or haven't been to China ever in their lives? Is it going to endanger people's lives? Are people going to blame, if they see a Chinese person in the street, are they going to blame them? Are they now in danger? When people get scared, they can do stupid things. And so when the president defends calling it the Chinese virus, he's basically saying, well, I can just kind of say what I want, and what other people do with the things I say is up to them. But that's not what it means to be president, right? It means to take responsibility kind of for an entire country. And if our president isn't willing to do that, it doesn't change the fact that we still need to be willing to do that. We should take responsibility at minimum, at least for the people immediately around us. And I know that sucks, and no one wants to hear that. Like, why? That's not the American way. Why should I have to take some? Because you can kill them. That's the deal. And vice versa. So on that happy note, I hope you have a wonderful week. Please stay safe.